Zene.
Jöttem 500 lett, hogy a véred folyjon el a sötétben. De piros, fehér, fekete gyász, a fehér filete a sötétben. Mert jaj, a cigány, minden éjjel fizeti az FBI. De otthon egyet csuvázik, a romarányi kinyúlik a sötétben. De jaj, a cigány, de minden éjjel fizetik az FBI. De otthon egyet csuvázik, a romarányi kinyúlik a sötétben. Tejének a dögatatlan lalátán, de ja Istenem, de nehéz az élete a cigánynak. De mert azt mindig utoljára a táskában találták itt az utcán. Jaj, a cigány, de minden éjjel fizeti az FBI. De otthon egyet csuvázik, a romarányi kinyúlik a sötétben. De jaj, a cigány, de minden éjjel fizeti az FBI. Ha otthon egyet csuvázik, a romarányi kinyúlik a sötétben. Adtam 500 lett, hogy a véred folyjon el a sötétben. De piros, fehér, fekete gyász, a fehér filete a sötétben. De jaj, a cigány, minden éjjel fizeti az FBI. De otthon egyet csuvázik, a romarányi kinyúlik a sötétben. De jaj, a cigány, minden éjjel fizeti az FBI. De otthon egyet csuvázik, a romarányi kinyúlik a sötétben. Tejének a dögadatlan, tejének a dögadatlan. Haragúztak a cigányok, mert én Audival járok. De haragúztak a cigányok, mert én Audival járok. De csorni megyek, de csorni megyek, de így élem én a világom. De melopni megyek, de csorni megyek, de így élem én a világom. Szólva az, jó jön Csiszeredával, Isten étesse, Afrikától. De haragúztak a cigányok, mert én Audival járok. De haragúztak a cigányok, mert én Audival járok. De lopni megyek, de csorni megyek, így élem én a világon. Mert én lopni megyek, de csorni megyek, de így élem én a világon. Tejének a dögadatlan, de haragúznak a cigányok, mert én Dacia-val járok. De lopni megyek, de csorni megyek, így élem én a világon. Mert én lopni megyek, de csorni megyek, így élem én a világon. Tejének a dögadatlan, jaj de la, jaj de la, jaj de la, az anyávé. Addig kell a moregás. De jaj de la, jaj de la, jaj de la, az anyávé. Addig kell a moregás. devla, jaj, devla, jaj, devla, jozanyád. Dikela, jaj, dikela, dikela, moregágy. Jaj, devla, jaj, devla, jaj, devla, moregágy. Dikela, jaj, dikela, jaj, dikela, moregágy. De úgy szeretem a papot, én vezek neki kalapot. De úgy szeretem a papnét, veszek neki kanapét. De úgy szeretem a papnét, veszek neki kanapét. De úgy szeretem a papot, veszek neki kalapét. De úgy szeretem a papnét, veszek neki kanapét. De úgy szeretem a papnét, veszek neki kanapét. De úgy szeretem a papnét, veszek neki kanapét. De ki volt itt, jaj, de ki járt itt, de kinek a pipája maradt itt. De csoró a ti az van itt, de annak a pipája, de maradt itt. Mert de csoró a ti az van itt, de annak a pipája, de maradt itt. De ki volt itt, jaj, de ki járt itt, de kinek a pipája, de maradt itt. De csorró a tiéd, az van itt, de annak a pipája maradt itt. De csorró a tiéd, az van itt, de annak a pipája, de maradt itt. Mert de csorró a tiéd, az van itt, de annak a pipája maradt itt. De nem mordom a kalapom, hogy ki vagyok, én megmutatom, talán. Csavargó életre vágyom, a feleségem ezzel bántom. A pénzemet, erre minden mulatom, akár csak megtáncoltatom, talán. De csavargó életre vágyom, a feleségem ezzel bántom. A pénzemet, erre minden mulatom, akár csak megtáncoltatom, talán. Lórinak csiszele rából, és kedves feleségének, testvérének, Robinak és feleségének. Harmadnapja nem vagyok, talán. Otthon kevesebb vagyok, talán. Sem az új életre vágyom, a feleségem ezzel bántom. A pénzemet én éri minden mulatom, akár csak megtáncoltatom, de sem az új életre vágyom, a feleségem ezzel bántom. A pénzemet éri minden mulatom, akár csak megtáncoltatom, de sem az új életre vágyom, a feleségem ezzel bántom. A pénzemet én minden mulatom, akár csak megtáncoltatom, talán.
نحن في المنطقة سنترك حالا
de felesége vissza. Szomorítson meg az Isten, de mikor semmi bajod sincsen. Ne szomorítson meg az Isten, de mikor semmi bajod sincsen. Azért nem lettél sogorom, haj de fekete vagy, mint a korom. De felteszem a kalapomat, így mulatom ki magamat. De felteszem a kalapomat, de így mulatom ki magamat. Azért nem lettél sogorom, de fekete vagy, mint a korom. De felteszem a kalapomat, de úgy kerázom ki magamat. De felteszem a kalapomat, de úgy mulatom ki magamat.
Ballista ready. Ballista ready. Ballista ready.
It's a rout.
Shoulder! Homs! We'll try our best. Ballista ready. Ready, sir. Quick! Ballista march. Ready. Ballista ready. Ballista ready.
Külsejű ember, nyilvánvalóan nem fiatal, de
Magyarország politikai berendezkedését sokféleképpen szokták címkézni, de abban mindenki, még Orbán Viktor is egyetért, hogy nem egy klasszikus, nyugati típusú liberális demokráciában élünk.
Az az új állam, amit Magyarországon építünk, az illiberális állam, nem liberális állam.
A hatalmi ágak szétválasztásától a politikai és gazdasági kapcsolatok összefonódásáig ez számos ponton megfigyelhető, és nincs ez másképpen az ország kormányzásával sem. Bár elsőre ez talán egy megfoghatatlan, elvont, amolyan köldöknézős témának tűnhet, valójában mindannyiunkat érint, hogy mennyire ismerhetjük meg az életünket befolyásoló döntéseket és azok hátterét. Erről fog szólni ez a videó, amelyben azt is megmutatjuk, hogy a magyar helyzet mellett hogy néz ki mindez Szlovákiában. A mögöttem látható épület az egykori karmelita kolostor. Itt található Orbán Viktor dolgozószobája, és itt szokták tartani a kormányüléseit is. Arról, hogy melyik nap mi történik ebben az épületben, folyosói pletykákon és háttérinformációkon kívül hivatalosan szinte semmit sem tudni.
Miután a miniszterelnök 2019-ben a várba költözött, a karmelita apró rést nyitott az egyre szűkülő hazai nyilvánosságban. Hétről hétre meg lehetett állítani a kormányülésre érkező minisztereket, itt derült ki például, hogy nem Varga Judit írja alá a titkos megfigyeléseket, és itt találkozhattunk utoljára az azóta súlyos korrupciós ügybe keveredő Völner Pállal is.
Önök elé nem állok szóba.
A helyzet 2021-ben változott meg, amikor lezárták az épülethez vezető közterületet, a Színház utcát. A hivatalos indoklás szerint a szemközti építkezés miatt.
Ott építési munkák zajlanak, és ezek még inkább élesbe fognak fordulni a következő hetekben. A bejutást lesz nehéz biztosítani.
A lezárás óta eltelt fél év, és a forgalom láthatóan zavartalan a Színház utcában. Hiába van kitéve a kordonra, hogy csak védő felszerelésben lehet közlekedni, a miniszterek, államtitkárok és a háttérstáb tagjai bármiféle óvintézkedés nélkül megközelíthetik a hivatalt. Az ellentmondásra június közepén egy kormányinfón próbáltam rákérdezni.
Szokott viselni védőfelszerelést, amikor megközelíti a karmelitát?
Nem félek ennyire a miniszterelnöktől.
Hát azért merül fel a kérdés, mert ugye a kordon, ami a Színház utca elejére ki van húzva, azon az a tábla szerepel, hogy védőfelszerelés nélkül belépni tilos.
Mindenféleképpen meg fogunk kérni a fővárosi kormányhivatalt, hogy vizsgálja meg alaposan a jogi helyzetet, és arra jutnak, akkor majd szólunk a kormánytagoknak, hogy azon az 1 méter, amik kilépnek a kocsiból és belépnek a karmelitába, addig bukósisakot, védőfelszerelést hordjanak.
Egyébként ez nem 1 méterről van, csak munkatársak, az államtitkárok, a épületegyüttesben dolgozó háttérstáb rendszeresen gyalog közelíti meg a karmelitát. A sajtó viszont ugye nem tud oda menni kérdezni.
Ott folyik, hogyha nem lett volna egyértelmű, egy komoly építkezés, közvetlenül a karmelitától 10 méterre található, nagyjából 10 méterre található épületben. Semmilyen másik építkezésnél se engednének oda közvetlenül, se újságírót, se más.
Na de akkor miért lehet az, hogy ki van rakva a kordonra az a tábla, hogy védőfelszerelés nélkül belépni tilos, és senki sem visel védőfelszerelést, amikor besétál oda?
Hát én azzal egyetértek, hogyha a közvetlen veszély az építkezés melletti nem 5-6 méteres sávban fennáll, akkor azt lehet, hogy külön el kell keríteni, de mondjuk ezzel nem biztos, hogy nekem kell foglalkozni.
Mit gondol, hogyha lezárul ez az építkezés, akkor a sajtó ismét megközelítheti el majd a kormányülések helyszíneit?
Hát én eddig is azon állásponton voltam, ez egy kisebbségi álláspont volt, hogy azt a szakasztot le kellene zárni. De eddig sem én döntöttem benne, ezért ezután sem én fogok.
Hogy a kíváncsi szemek zavarták a hatalmat, az nem volt kérdéses. Amikor annak próbáltunk utána járni, hogy mit csinál pontosan a Fidesz propaganda gépezetét is irányító Rogán Antal, Szentkirály Alexandra kormány szóvivő közölte, hogy nem tetszik neki, ahogy kérdezünk.
Önök maximálisan túlmennek azon egyébként, ami a normál újságírói keretek közé vehető, azzal a zaklatással, aminek gyakorlatilag nagyon sok esetben például ide bejöve is kiteszik az embereket, akik próbálnak ide bejönni.
A kormánytagot próbálunk megkérdezni a munkájáról, az zaklatásnak minősül?
De azt gondolom, hogy ahogy önök ezt csinálják, az már bőven az a kategória.
A karmelita körbekerítése egy szimbólum, amely megmutatja, hogy a hatalom mennyire szeretné, hogy a sajtón keresztül az állampolgárok belelássanak a működésébe. Ugyanebbe a körbe tartozik, hogy az ország irányítása szempontjából legfontosabb fórum, a kormány ülései lényegében titokban, a nyilvánosság teljes kizárásával zajlanak.
Nem lehet tudni, hogy mikor ül össze a kabinet, és milyen témákat fognak tárgyalni. Amikor rákérdeztem erre a miniszterelnökségnél, nem kaptam választ. Az Orbán kormányok üléseiről sok évtizedes hagyományokkal szakítva már egy ideje hangfelvétel sem készül.
Véget ért a kormányülés, hosszú menet volt.
Az utókor csak összefoglalókból ismerheti majd meg, hogyan született egy súlyos döntés.
Amit mi érzékelünk a politikából, vagy amit az állampolgárok érzékelnek a politikából, abból a szempontból a kormányülés nem feltétlenül releváns. Egyébként az ország működtetése és működése szempontjából nagyon releváns, de a kormány nem mindig azt a látszott akarja elérni, hogy a valódi munkáról esik szó a nyilvánosságban.
Kevés tudásunk van arról, hogy egész pontosan mi zajlik a kormányüléseken. Az biztos, hogy ne egy olyan fórumként képzeljük el, ahová behoznak versengő erőterjesztéseket, ötletelnek, aztán kisül ebből valami.
Vannak, hogy mondjam, gyakorlati válaszokat, amiket meg kell adni a kormányülésen, de a fő stratégiai kérdések ezek inkább a kommunikációs tímben dőlnek el. Ebben ugye Rogán Antal van benne, ő a kommunikációs minisztériumnak a vezetője, Habony Árpád, aki egy fontos tanácsadója a miniszterelnöknek, és hát néhány ember, akik még a frakcióvezető, akik, hogy mondjam, megvalósításában a kommunikációnak részt vesznek. Tehát az nem lehet szerintem mondani, hogy a kormányülés nem fontos fórum, mert fontos fórum, de inkább ezeknek a stratégiai koncepcióknak az artikulálásában vagy gyakorlatiassá tételében.
A döntéshozatalnak a folyamatát úgy térképezhetjük fel, hogy a miniszterelnök kabinettjében, Rogán Antal stábjában dől el az, hogy milyen irányba indul el a kormány, majd utána az egyes szakpolitikai célokat az adott minisztériumok valósítják meg. És mindez nem zárja ki, hogy a kormányülésen mondjuk tényleg egy hatékony munka folyik, adott esetben vita is legyen, de az, hogy egyáltalán mi kerül napirendre, az egészen biztos a miniszterelnök környezetében dől el.
A politikai csinálás és a kommunikáció nagyon sok esetben elválik egymástól, vagy az, hogy mi történik a kormányülésen, abból a közönség nem feltétlenül érzékel bármit is. Mert ha az van kiadva, hogy most migrációs válság van, és persze nyilván valamennyire van, de a kommunikáció az 85%-ban szól erről, a kormányülésen meg valószínűleg csak 25%-ban van erről szó. Tehát, hogy ezek azért nem, ez mindig egy stratégiai döntés, hogy mi az, amit a kormány, illetve a miniszterelnök és a stábja az tematizálni akar, és egy másik, hogy egyébként van egy szervezet, aminek működtetnie kell az országot.
Az Orbán kormányok számára a látszat is kiemelten fontos. A rendszer demokratikus díszleteinek szempontjából nélkülözhetetlen esemény a kormányinfó, ahol cenzúra nélkül releváns kérdéseket lehet feltenni a miniszterelnökséget vezető miniszternek, és időnként még érdemi válaszokat is lehet kapni. Igaz, a negyedik kétharmad ebben is változást hozott, és a kormányinfón is szűkültek a kérdezés lehetőségei.
És a jövőben pedig abban állapotunk meg miniszter úrral, hogy egy mindenki számára előre tudható, hiszen most jelzem ezt, 2 órás időkeret fog rendelkezésre állni a kormányinfók egészére, beleértve a kérdéseket is.
Bár a kormányinfónak elvileg arról kellene szólnia, hogy milyen munkát végez a kormány, az idő jelentős részében a fideszes propagandagépezet dolgozóinak köszönhetően valami egészen másról van szó.
Hogyan értékelik politikailag az ellenzék viselkedését április 3-a óta?
Nem kellene a Jakab Péternek vállalni a felelősséget. Ön szerint mi lehetett az oka, hogy kb. 850 000 ellenzéki szavazó 2018-hoz képest úgymond eltűnt? Hogy Márki-Zay Péter mellett nem álltak ki a szövetségesei? Hogyan fognak ezek az ellenzéki pártok a következő 4 évben együttműködni?
Minek köszönhető a baloldalnak a történelmi bukása. A bűnbakkeresés mellett megkezdődött a marakodás egyébként a baloldalon, még egy picit a baloldalnál maradva, a választás óta
De nem csak a politikailag irányított kérdések miatt emlékezetes a kormányinfó. Előfordult már olyan is, hogy a miniszterelnök előzetes bejelentés nélkül jelent meg a sajtótájékoztatón, így az újságírók nem készülhetek neki külön kérdésekkel.
Következőben is számíthatunk arra, hogy váratlanul megjelenik a kormányinfón? Nem lesz belőle a rendszer.
Van egy rendszer minden évben, január elején, vagy az utolsó évzáró, vagy az első évindító sajtótájékoztatót szívesen megtartom, örömmel látom önöket. Akivel úgy látom, hogy értelmes párbeszédet tudok folytatni, azoknak szívesen adok interjút is egyébként, és arra kérem önöket, hogy érjék be belőle mennyivel.
Az is emlékezetes volt, amikor a Pegazus megfigyelési botrány közepén váratlanul felbukkant Varga Judit. A miniszter mindössze pár percre jelent meg a teremben, tartott egy monológot más témában, majd lelépett.
A karméta lezárva, a kormányinfón korlátozottak a lehetőségek, de ott van még a parlament, ahol a nyilvánosság elvileg megismerhetné a kormány munkáját és a döntések hátterét. Távolról nézve ez talán így is van, hiszen látszólag minden a helyén. Az országgyűlés hetente ülésezik, rendszeresen megjelennek vezető politikusok, akik időnként kérdésekre is válaszolnak. Akkor minden rendben van? Hát nem egészen.
A 2010-es Orbán kormány megalakulása után egy darabig még kis túlzással virágzott a demokratikus nyilvánosság a parlamentben. Szinte bárhol lehetett forgatni, és fontos politikusokkal lehetett akár a dolgozó szobájukban is interjúzni. Közben azonban a rendszer elkezdett keményedni.
Az országgyűlés elnök ugyanis radikálisan szeretné csökkenteni a parlamentbe akkreditált újságíróknak a számát. Jelenleg több száz, körülbelül 900 ilyen akkreditált újságíró van, ezt a 130-ra szeretné csökkenteni. Az indoklás szerint azért, hogy az országgyűlés méltósága megmaradjon, illetve állítólag az újságírók munkája is kényelmesebb lesz. Lesz egy csomó átszervezés, és forgatni sem lehet ott, ahol eddig lehetett. Nem normálisabb, hogy a képviselők megtanulnak mondjuk úgy is nyilatkozni, ha éppen nem tudnak valamit, mint hogy a médiát elzárjuk egy teljesen távoli terembe?
Mély vizet itt se úgyse lehet elkerülni, erről csak ezt tudom neked mondani.
A következő években Kövér László sorra tiltotta ki az újságírókat. Az országház szabályait pedig addig faragta, hogy ma már az ülésterem környéke tiltott zóna, és egy nem túl frekventált társalgót leszámítva lényegében csak egy buszmegállónyi területen mozoghat a sajtó. Az ülésterembe menet könnyű elkerülni ezt a sarkot, de ha valaki arra jár, akkor is ritka, hogy érdemben megálljon nyilatkozni. Egy-egy forgatás alatt többnyire ilyen jelenetekbe szoktunk belefutni.
És megállíthatjuk? Kösz. Most KDNP-s témakörben akarjuk kérdezni. Kérdés, megállíthatjuk?
Visszafele jó, mert beszélnem
Mikor lesz az? Köszönöm.
A külügyminiszter végül nem jött vissza. Mint ahogyan nem volt szerencsénk legutóbb Tuzson Bencével sem, akit országosan talán kevesen ismernek, pedig jelentős pozíciót visel. Ő Rogán Antal jobb keze, és ő írja például a kormányülések összefoglalóit. Hiába próbálkozunk nála, szinte soha nem áll meg nyilatkozni, legutóbb sem tett kivételt, mert éppen fontos közfeladatot ment ellátni. Interjú helyett egy videót gyártott TikTokra, ami a forgatásunk másnapján meg is jelent.
Te hallottál már olyat, hogy egy pincér feje beszorul az ételliftbe? Mindez itt a parlamentben, a vadászteremben történt, 100 esztendővel ezelőtt, de szerencsére már akkor is volt orvosi ügyelet. Így megmentették.
Nem kézenfekvő a magyarázat, hogy miért próbálunk egyébként rendszeresen kamerával és mikrofonnal feltenni kérdéseket a legfontosabb politikusoknak. Hiszen a 2010 előtti világban még nem csinálta ezt ennyiszer a sajtó.
Az volt 2010 előtt, hogy mondjuk országgyűlési képviselőket nagyon könnyű volt telefonon fölhívni, elérni, információt szerezni tőlük. Államtitkárt se volt nehéz, de akár minisztert se volt nehéz, akár a mobilján elérni, és jó eséllyel tudtunk velük beszélni, adtak információt, minél magasabb pozícióban volt valaki, annál szabadabban tudott értelemszerűen beszélni. Volt egy ilyen közléskényszer bennük, valahogy más volt a sajtóhoz való viszony. Azt nem mondanám, hogy mi különösebben barátiak lettünk volna, mert én úgy érzem, hogy 2010 előtt is ugyanolyan kritikusak voltunk az aktuális hatalommal, mint 2010 után.
A miniszterek és a miniszterelnök ma már nem csak a sajtó számára elérhetetlen, hanem a demokratikusan megválasztott parlamenti ellenzéknek sincsen könnyű dolga, ha válaszokat akar. Az írásban feltett, szakpolitikai jellegű kérdésekre is sokszor az a válasz, hogy Gyurcsány, Brüsszel vagy Soros, de a személyesen feltett kérdésekre is sokszor hasonló minőségű felelet érkezik.
Hogy van az, hogy itt terrorizmusért is körözött emberek flangálhatnak az ön közelében? Kiderült Gaid faraonról, hogy önhöz érkezett vacsorára. Kiderült Gaid faraonról, hogy az ön vejével üzletel. Hogy van ez? Magyarázza meg. És kérdésem az, hogy örökölnek-e valamit Gaid faraon vagyonából, és hogy milyen garanciát tud adni arra a magyar embereknek, hogy nem ön jelenti a legnagyobb nemzetbiztonsági kockázatot.
Köszönöm szépen, képviselőasszony. A válaszra megadom a szót Orbán Viktor miniszterelnök úrnak. Parancsoljon, miniszterelnök úr, öné a szó.
Milyen tisztelt elnök úr, tisztelt képviselőtársam, boldog karácsonyt kívánok!
Magyarországon 2022-ben szinte már természetesnek tűnik, hogy a közvélemény számára nem átlátható, hogyan születnek meg az emberek életét befolyásoló döntések, pedig egy normális demokráciában ez egyáltalán nem magától értetődő. Nem kell messzire mennünk, nézzük meg a kormány és a nyilvánosság kapcsolatát, például Szlovákiában.
Pozsonyban a kormányülések előtt a kabinet honlapján megjelenik, hogy mikor lesz ülés és mik lesznek azok a határozati javaslatok, amelyeket tárgyal a kormány. Az újságírók bemehetnek a kormányhivatal épületébe, és az ülés előtt és után is kérdezhetik az ország vezetőit, akik a saját területeket illetően időnként sajtótájékoztatókat is szoktak tartani. Amikor ott voltunk, akkor is azt láttuk, hogy a vezető politikusok szóba állnak a sajtóval.
Ez már az utóbbi néhány kormány idején gyakorlatilag ugyanígy zajlik. hajszálnyi különbségek vannak attól függően, hogy az egyes kormányok miniszterei mennyire szeretnek közvetlen kapcsolatot tartani a sajtóval. A Fico kormányok idején előfordult az, hogy a miniszterek a kormányülésre jövet annyira nem álltak szóba a sajtó képviselőivel, de ott is azért mondjuk az ülés után néhány szót azért az újságírókkal is váltottak.
Az ülés a sajtó számára olyannyira megközelíthető, hogy még magára a tanácskozásra is be lehet menni vágóképeket készíteni. Mindez persze kis dolognak tűnhet, de jelzi, hogy a hatalom a legfontosabb döntéshozói fórumot nem csak a gondosan megkomponált propagandaképekkel hagyja illusztrálni.
Ezen kívül előfordul az is, hogy a minisztereket elkísérhetjük a hivatalos útjaikra, akár kormánygéppel Brüsszelbe, vagy mondjuk az adott miniszteri konvojjal éppen Budapestre. Ha abból indulunk ki, hogy mely médiumok kritikusak a kormánnyal, a mögöttem látható kollégák nagy része, és ők is ugyanígy itt tartózkodhatnak a kormányülés épületében, ahol mi is itt vagyunk éppen, és ugyanúgy a szolgálati utakra, vagy hát ezekre a külföldi utakra is elkísérik az adott minisztereket, esetleg a miniszterelnököt, és ugyanúgy kritikus és éles kérdéseket tesznek föl ezeken a külföldi sajtótájékoztatókon is az illetékes minisztereknek, miniszterelnöknek.
A környező országok közül nem Szlovákia az egyetlen, ahol a kormány közel engedi magához a sajtót. A szlovákhoz hasonló rendszer működik évtizedek óta Ausztriában, de Csehországban is már az ülések előtt megismerheti a nyilvánosság, hogy milyen témákat fog tárgyalni a kabinet. Ehhez képest a Fidesz egy nagyon más gyakorlatot követ.
Elkezdtek 2010-ben brutálisan építkezni, illetve hát folytatták azt az építkezést, amit már 2010 előtt is elkezdtek, és ugye most látjuk ezt a sajtóbirodalmat, amit kinőtt, tehát nekik untig elég az, hogy ott van a vidéki laphálózat, az MTVA, mindent el tudnak mondani, és ha vannak máshol diszonáns hangok, azzal meg nem foglalkoznak egyszerűen. És látszik, hogy működik, mert a választási eredmények azok ezt igazolják vissza. Az más kérdés, hogy ez mennyire demokratikus gyakorlat.
Az, hogy tudjuk közvetíteni a kormánynak a működését, tehát előre látjuk a kormányhatározatok tervezeteit, ezeket végig tudjuk nézni, meg tudjuk benne találni azokat a pontokat, amelyek mondjuk az olvasóinkat kifejezetten érinthetik. Azt gondolom, hogy ezáltal gyakorlatilag a választópolgár is sokkal jobban követheti azt, hogy az általa megválasztott kormány az végül is mit tesz, vagy mit nem tesz.
Nagyobb és komplexebb videókat csak a nézőink és az olvasóink segítségével tudunk készíteni. Ha szeretnél több ilyet látni a Telexen, akkor támogasd a munkánkat, és persze ne felejts el feliratkozni a csatornánkra sem.
Clues that mushrooms were understood, that other plants may have been used, the knowledge of which has been lost. And the Cultural Revolution did a pretty thorough job on wiping out this kind of traditional Taoist shamanic data. But a very simple way of focusing the problem is to say there has never been reported from China a psilocybin-containing mushroom. And yet, I'll bet if a reasonably informed investigator were to go to southern China and spend no more than 2 or 3 months off the beaten path talking to country people, I'll bet you could come up with half a dozen psychoactive mushrooms with a history of folk usage. It's simply the question has not been asked. Well, we are going to not have a clear understanding of the historical development of Chinese thought and institutions unless we know what their relationship to the invisible world precisely was. And I think the indigenous tradition of shamanism, which became then Taoism, which became the real substratum of Chinese religion while it weathered various late grafted variants and foreign imports like Buddhism, but that native stratum of Taoistic shamanism hints very, very strongly that there were psychedelic usage of these plants in ancient China. Okay, that's it for today, and we'll see you at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Sorry to give you such a burst of information, but this will lay the basis, I hope, for tomorrow's discussion. So think about what we didn't cover, what you hope to hear that you haven't, and then tomorrow we'll try to tie up all the loose threads. Thanks very much. Sure. Okay, it looks like almost everybody is here. There was a woman yesterday who isn't here. I wonder if she was a one-dayer or if she'll show up. Do you all remember her? No one saw her but me. Yes, she sat. Yes. Oh, she will. Okay, well, it's always somewhat late on Sunday morning, so we'll... A couple of people expressed interest in this week that I'm doing at Esalen, so I might describe it a little bit. It's quite different from this. It's an in-depth involvement in the mathematics of the I Ching, and then a theory that I evolved out of my engagement with that has to do with the structure of time and analysis of history as a predictable phenomenon. It has no connection with psychedelics other than that the entire thing was dreamed up under the influence of psychedelics. But it's a standalone idea, and if I am able to control the group, I will keep it quite far from psychedelics, except in moments of rhetorical desperation. But if you're interested in the I Ching, and don't let the word mathematics put you off. I am not a mathematician, and the best mathematicians aren't either. You simply, it's just a way of talking about it and doing analysis that was very fruitful. So that's a 5-day from the 28th of this month till the 2nd of December. And Esalen has given us the big house. And a lot of people will bring their computers. There'll be a lot of machine implementation people. It'll go from Taoist scholars to assembly language programmers. And everybody will have more of a contribution to make than they suspect at the time. So I'm not sure. It was filled, and then I think they switched it. So, because I thought it was going to be at Fritz, but I don't know. Call them and see. That's all I can say about that. Seems like there was something else.
It's a route.
Well, hopefully you turned some of this over in your mind in the time that we've been apart. I certainly did, in the sense of trying to figure out what I had missed and whose concerns had not been met. And what I came up with was your interest in the specifics of time, place, and manner, which should certainly be covered because it's operational information. Talking about the various visionary plant complexes that we talked about yesterday, each one of these things has a style and a set of demands that it makes on its practitioners. And if you look at the ethnographic literature, you then see how the people who've used these things over millennia have come to terms with them, how they have accommodated themselves to these things. For instance, in the Iboka cult of Gabon, what is aimed for is early on in the involvement with the plant, a massive dose is taken, and they say it splits your head open, and you never have to take very much again, because somehow a creode or a predilection has been created, and then you are initiated into this. When you read the ethnographic literature, it's hard to believe how much they say they are taking. I mean, there's a saying in Gabon, Bawiti, which is what they call Iboga. Bawiti begins at 60, and that means 60 grams. Well, even allowing for the fact that they're using fresh root, and you might get a collapse rate of close to 50 or 75%, that still means they're saying Bawiti begins at 15 to 20 grams, which from my own experience with this stuff, I can tell you, is not even a conceivable place to begin. That's not a strong hit. That's an impossible hit. So the mushrooms, and you have to know, pharmacologically speaking, the window of effective activity. Every drug, every compound has a profile which you can imagine as a linear spectrum. Below a certain amount, it's undetectable. Above that amount, it becomes detectable first as this CNS arousal that I mentioned yesterday, and then as a full-blown psychedelic experience, and then at higher doses it begins to have toxic effects. All drugs are toxins, and people often make the mistake of thinking that if you have a toxic substance and you take half of it, then it's not toxic, because there is no you don't register its effects. But of course, everything is incrementally toxic. Now, some things are very safe, have a great range of effectiveness, well below the range where any toxicity begins to set in. Other compounds are active as psychedelics at a level just slightly below the level where you're going to begin to have toxic effects. So you want to know what the profile is of the particular substance that you're thinking of taking. In pharmacology, one of the parameters that they establish is what's called an LD50, which is a fairly unpleasant concept, which you should nevertheless be informed of. LD50 means lethal dose 50. This means we have 100 mice. We give them an unknown drug. At the point where half of them die, that is the LD50 dose of that compound. And there's an LD100, an LD10, and so forth. What you want is for the LD50 to be tremendously high relative to the effective dose. Now, the perfect or model compound in that case is, of course, LSD. LSD is active at the 25 microgram range, 25 gamma. A microgram is a millionth of a gram. It's well below a smidgen. Now, the LD50 for lysergic acid has never been determined. Do you agree? It's never been found how much it takes to kill half of the test animals. So that makes it a tremendously safe drug if mortality is the only concern. But of course, I think what most psychedelic trippers eventually realize is mortality is rarely at risk in psychedelic experiences. What's at risk is sanity. And, you know, being nuts is not as bad as being dead, but nevertheless, it can spoil your entire day. So, and it's very reassuring, having taken a compound like psilocybin and to have become totally convinced that you are dying, to just remind yourself that the LD50 is 200 times more than you took, and therefore it's impossible, and you merely have to discipline the hindbrain and take control of your fear, and then you will be all right. And you're a pharmacologist.
But when you're in it, you really
When,
you're dying.
when you're in it and you think you're dying, you weren't able to say to yourself, now see here, no one has ever died at this dose level, and well, it is a question.
You start imagining that perhaps there was something in there that wasn't just psilocybin.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Or your heart can't bear it. I thought I had tachycardia and I thought
Pound right out of your chest. That you make a point which I want to elaborate on. We've talked so much about hallucination here, and always because of my particular bent, which I have unconsciously transferred to you, we're talking about visual hallucinations. But all psychedelic explorers should be aware of the concept of what is called a cognitive hallucination. This is a much more insidious phenomenon. This is quite simply an out-and-out delusion. The commonest form of cognitive hallucination goes like this. You take mushrooms. An hour and 20 minutes into it, it's getting mighty, mighty strange. And this is especially a problem with first-timers. And you realize, with the force of revelation, that you didn't take psilocybin. You took a poisonous mushroom, and now you are going to die. This is an out-and-out cognitive hallucination, which is as real as a belief. But it's not a disturbance in the visual field, it's a disturbance in the cognitive machinery. A story, a friend of mine had never taken mushrooms and was very concerned about how to do it, and said, and got the instructions from me: silent darkness, quiet room, stay sitting, and took them in his room in silent darkness, and at about the hour and a half point, realized with a demonic chuckle that I had been kidding. I had been putting him on, and actually had told him to stay in his room because we were preparing a surprise party for him at the bar 2 blocks down the street. And, you know, chuckling to himself with this realization, he showered, dressed, and went down to the bar 2 blocks down the street, pushed open the door and said, "I'm here." And the guy behind the bar said, "Oh, really?" Well, the trip got wilder from there, because in the wake of disconfirmation of one of these cognitive hallucinations, people tend to become confused, paranoid, and upset. So you have to continuously track your mental processes, and it's really good to stick with whatever rules that you've laid down for yourself. I actually apply this technique in my own life. If I get to the place where I cannot understand what is happening, I try to think back to the last moment when I did understand what was happening, and then do what I said I was going to do then, having given up on understanding it in the moment. The practical fallout from this in terms of psychedelic research is what we call the chain to a tree technique, which is where you just chain yourself to a tree, and providing you don't hang yourself with the chain, this cuts down the possibility of doing something peculiar. Psychedelics tend to be, this doesn't tend to be a problem, but for instance with Datura, the best intended and most together people lose it completely and then come back into it 12 or 24 hours later to just survey the swath of wreckage that they have cut through their own and other people's lives. I had a friend years ago, a very diminutive, attractive woman who took Datura with a couple of boyfriends, waited hours and hours, nothing happened. They finally decided to go to their homes. She walked them down the stairs, said goodbye to them at the top of the stairs. It actually happened in the Haight. And that was the last thing she remembered until she came to on the 6th floor of the federal building in the San Francisco County Jail. And the charge was assault on a resting officer. And the evidence was the officer's thumb, which had been bitten off. So she was, you know, an Antioch PhD in medieval literature. So it happens to the best of us. Yeah. Yeah, you can. The problem, the ideal situation, and always I'm only speaking from my own experience, and I may have an odd take on it because God knows I'm odd, but to my mind, the ideal situation is to have the sitter 2 rooms away, and you have a doorbell or the equivalent. Because if the sitter is with you, you start to analyze the sitter. And as someone once said to me in India, face is index of mind. And the sitter can just become an existential galaxy of possibilities because, you know, you can read their history, their intent, their most secret thoughts, your belief in what is their most secret thoughts. People are concrescences of ambiguity that you don't want to get too tangled up with in that state unless you really are ready for the trip to take that particular direction. I don't know if it was in this workshop or the other night that I mentioned, I recall a trip I took with this English guy, and it took me 2 weeks to get his voice out of my head. It just became like this accompaniment to consciousness, this stream of sort of understated English upper-class gibberish on all subjects. And I finally, you know, it retracted. That's called becoming a victim of the transference. All psychotherapists are aware of this. The transference is when you get dragged into the other person's system of values or delusion. There's even a name for this in clinical psychology. It's called allophrenia. Allophrenia is schizophrenic behavior on the part of normal people in the presence of schizophrenics. And this is a real problem. Your friend is put in the place. You go to see your friend to cheer them up. And your friend is not violently insane, but saying strange things, behaving in strange ways. And you, in an effort to relate to them, begin saying strange things and behaving in strange ways. And before you know it, you know, the resident has to break in and escort you to the elevator because you're causing a problem in the ward. The transference is this phenomenon happening among people who are more or less psychologically healthy, but still it can be very disrupting. I think the sitter should be there only if there's a 3-dimensional emergency. And the sitter, the notion, I like the word sitter because it's operational. It tells what you should do. And guide is not such a pleasing word. This implies control, prior knowledge, hierarchy, so forth and so on. The best guide sitter I ever knew was a wonderful old guy. He's dead now, but I'm not yet ready to say his name in public. I'm sure some of you know him. But his style was, he read these paperback trash novels, you know, and he would just sit down with somebody, give them the stuff, and every once in a while they would fight their way out of this ocean of hallucination to deliver some insight, and he would just put down his book and turn to them and say, "That's nice, now go back to the music." Pick up his book, and, you know, this guy could get 600 pages in a situation where he was nominally in charge of a dozen people who were tripping. So non-intervention, I think, and then there's the question of doing it with another person. And then the question is it going, meaning that the other person is going to be stoned too. And this has its own pitfalls and ambiguities. If it's your lover, your sexual partner, then in my opinion that's probably the best way to spend your time. If it's not, then you know, the sky is the limit. You're going to learn more about this person than perhaps you were prepared to. Sometimes it's easy. It's no problem. Everybody stays who they appeared to be before you took off. But sometimes, you know, the masks just start being hurled across the room in all directions, and you don't know where it's going to leave you. My approach, I guess, is one of two extremes. I guess I sort of belong to the sensory deprivation school, that lie down, shut up, silent darkness, music very judiciously, if at all, and I always do it at night, which some people find that strange, but night is quiet. The energy dies down. There's calm and still between midnight and 4 a.m. The other end of the spectrum is someone like Salvador Roquette, who, you know, gives you 3 drugs, plays heavy metal rock and roll, then you get to see the Auschwitz films. And no, I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. I mean, it is an effort to, so far as I can tell, drive you absolutely starkers, you know, and I would not submit myself to that. This same polarity exists in therapeutic theories. Some schools of therapy want you to lose it, want you to weep, lament, rend your clothing, throw yourself on the floor, kick your feet in the air, and this is called getting out your stuff or working through your stuff. What I find about this kind of thing is it resonates too long. You know, it doesn't feel like you've gotten clear of it. It feels like you have simply objectified it. But, you know, life is an uncompleted puzzle. I could certainly change my mind. I have never felt that the primary use of these things was to cure what is called in modern parlance neurosis, what I call unhappiness. It isn't for that. It is, and again, this may be the influence of Jung in my background. You know, Jung felt that there was no such thing as normality, that life, the task of life was what he called individuation. And he felt it really doesn't even begin until you approach middle life. I mean, you must leave the 20s behind you because they are so socially and hormonally turbulent that you're just basically trying to make sense of it on a day-to-day basis. But then you settle in and this unfolding takes place. And I really assume that we are all beyond neurosis. Not that we are not neurotic, but that we all have our own strategies and our own take on our own quirks and peculiarities. The psychedelic thing as tool is more to go beyond the legacy of the normal into the transpersonal or the suprapersonal, and really view life as an open-ended domain to be explored. So I find myself talking to psychologists a lot because this is where this has been seized upon, because it does perturb the dynamics of the psyche. But for instance, I don't think you should give people hospitalized for psychotic behavior psychedelics. They're having enough trouble. They are being overwhelmed by the contents of the unconscious 24 hours a day and have no tool to make sense of it. The rest of us can make sense of overwhelmment by the unconscious if it doesn't go on too long. I mean, I don't think there's any one of us who would wish to take mushrooms, arrive at the height, and just stay there. Because after 48, 72 hours, some situation would arise which would cast us into an extreme state of disequilibrium. It's more like diving. A friend of mine said many, many years ago, the yogin and sub-in, shaman, psychedelic voyager, the yogin and the schizophrenic dive in the same ocean. It's just that the yogin remembers to take his tanks along. And that's what it is, you know. I mean, there is this possibility of inundation and overwhelmment. Well, let's return to the matter of dosage and set and setting. Yeah.
Yesterday, how you favored organic materials over synthetic. What about, taking organic materials but then refining, narrowing them down and getting rid of all the other ingredients in the plants? Because that's our Western tendency, is to just take something, refine it down, isolate the active ingredients, and then take doses of that. Do you see that the other natural ingredients that the mushrooms or ayahuasca, whatever it is, have provided, kind of synergize the active ingredients and make the trip easier or smoother?
Yeah, I think so. Rarely in a plant where you have a psychoactive compound will it occur all by itself. For instance, in the peyote cactus, there is mescaline, there's N-methylmescaline, there's anhalamine, anhaloine, well, there's a whole family, about a dozen of these things. Similarly, in the coca bush, cocaine and several other canes and several other active compounds. So when you take a plant, you're getting a broad spectrum of these active molecules that have a familial relationship to each other. And no chemist has ever exactly explained to me what's happening, but I think all chemists and pharmacologists are aware of the fact that natural compounds, even extracted and purified, or let's just say even extracted, are smoother than their synthetic counterpart. I recently had occasion to relearn this because there's been some amount of experimentation with 5-methoxy-DMT, which is not like DMT, but it is short-acting and creates a profound oceanic emotion. But it also, in the pure substance, there's a tremendous heart rush in the first 30 seconds. I mean, you just feel like you're in an up elevator that knows no limit. And just about the time that you figure you're going to go into some kind of emergency situation, it tends to back off. So then, recently, there has been this material in the underground called toad foam, which is actually 5-methoxy-DMT extracted from the glands of a large southwestern toad. Well, when you smoke that, it too is 5-MeO-DMT, but there is no heart rush, and it also doesn't last as long. It's much more benign and easygoing. Even in cases where there isn't a detectably variant spectrum of compounds present, for instance, in the psilocybin in Stropharia cubensis, really there are only two active principles, psilocybin and psilocin is the dephosphorylated ester of psilocybin, so they are basically the same compound. Nevertheless, if you talk to somebody who has only taken Sandoz psilocybin, it's much less animated and interesting than organic psilocybin. Now, the counterexample to this is when Hoffman synthesized psilocybin for the first time, he gave some of it to Wasson, and Wasson took it back to Huautla in the Sierra Mazateca of Oaxaca and gave it to Maria Sabina. And Maria Sabina said, "The spirit of the mushroom is in the little pill." And this story has been repeated over and over again. Well, my assumption simply is, Maria Sabina was a wily old lady. I mean, it's not writ anywhere that shamans have to always tell you the truth. And I very seriously doubt that the experience, I've never had the opportunity to take chemically pure psilocybin. The difference between the morning glories and LSD is one of animation and color. The morning glories, you see, I'm talking now about Ipomoea and turbina, the Mexican species. When you take them, there is a flood of Aztec, Toltec, Mayan imagery. It's just, it's uncanny. You can't believe it while it's happening, that you would see this much glyphs and carved obsidian and quetzal feathers and all of this stuff. Is it the morphogenetic field? Is it the broader vegetable spectrum of the alkaloid rather than the synthetic? Who knows? These things remain to be looked at. In terms of the theory of morphogenetic resonance, it seems to me, some of you probably follow Rupert's ideas and Rupert himself. The problem is that the morphogenetic field is very difficult for instruments to detect. And in fact, I think so far the only instrument that can detect it is the human mind. And this probably means, that it's perturbing a field that is very, very far removed from the fields associated with the 4 or 5 ordinary forces of nature. But for instance, when you go to Tikal, or in Guatemala, or Borobudur in central Java, or Konarak on the Puri coast of India, and you take these psychedelics, the past is present. You see these places at their height, and you can say, well, it's just suggestion, But I don't know. When I take ayahuasca, wherever I take it, I encounter the motifs typical of Amazonian shamanism. The jaguar, the giant anaconda, to show you that sometimes the iconography of these compounds is not predictable, black people. And everyone in the Amazon says this, that you see black people. Well, there are no black people in the Amazon, not really. In the lower Amazon there are a few, but in the upper Amazon, a black person is as rare as a curd. And yet, everybody insists on this. Well, I have had this experience on ayahuasca, and to call it seeing black people is a very mild gloss on what it is. It's like being at the Apollo Ballroom on a hot evening in 1960 and Aretha Franklin is on stage. It is deep hit of blackness. Yeah, I don't know quite what to make of it, you know. I don't know why. And Claudio Naranjo gave the ayahuasca, gave harmaline to urban people in Santiago, Chile, stockbrokers and advertising executives, people who had no connection to the jungle, and they reported jaguars, giant snakes, jungles, and black people. So this, to me, is a tremendously fertile area for Jungians, for morphogenetic field people to look into. Psychics have claimed, since who knows how long, that by holding an object in their hand, they could penetrate its past states of being. Well, it's like all these other occult claims, in my experience, mantra, yantra, yoga posturing, past life recovery. For me, none of these things are possible unless I'm stoned. Then they all become possible. It's just like you just throw the switch. Suddenly mantras work. I can chant mantras till hell freezes over in an unstoned state. The precondition for empowering occult idea systems seems to be a shift in brain chemistry. And it's, you know, to be noted that in these cultures where a lot of magic, a lot of violation of natural law is going on, there is a lot of psychedelic stuff going on. These ayahuasca shamans, say among the Aguaruna Jivaro, for instance, which is a very no-nonsense tribe of head-hunting people in the Amazon, the shamans live continuously in a state of altered consciousness. I mean, they are taking this stuff all the time. It is a food item. And what it would be like to be the shaman of the Aguaruna in the jungle all the time, taking all this stuff, it's hard to imagine, because when you just do it once, all plants have auras, all plants have songs which can be extracted out of them. I mean, they are living literally in some kind of other dimension. Yeah.
Back, if I can, for a minute about this whole idea of certain plants or certain substances have certain attributes or certain places that they take people to. I've had the ideation that you're talking about, the visualization, the cats, the jungle, the pyramids, the whole Mayan Aztec jungle, shamanic routine on LSD, on mushrooms, on ibogaine, and on yahe. And I've had clients that have had that same ideation doing breath work.
Well,
So-
yeah, this
so where does
raises
that, you know,
this
where-
raises a real question. One of the things.
The black people were on ibogaine, which I expected, but not the other part.
Yeah, I don't understand exactly how this works. I will join your side for a moment, because there's a phenomenon I've noticed, and some of you have heard me talk about it. It's possible to do this on psilocybin. It's really easy to do it on ayahuasca. Ayahuasca, in a way, is somehow more open to suggestion. These other things have their own agenda. Ayahuasca will work with you. But one of the bizarre things that you can do on ayahuasca is you can suggest a period, like, let's say, Italian Baroque. You just say it in your mind. And paintings, altarpieces, architectural spaces, balustrades, vehicles, armament, saddlery, clothing, serving utensils, bowls, pewter, candelabra, all of this stuff will begin drifting toward, and it's just, and it is high Baroque. In fact, it is more Baroque than the Baroque. It's obviously what they were shooting for, you know? And then you just say dynastic Egypt, a hawk-headed, and you say Art Deco, and thousands of cigarette lighters, coffee tables, yeah, and more intensely realized than you ever actually encounter these things in real life. Well, now what does that mean? I have no idea, first of all. The possibilities seem to be that what we call styles, or what we call motifs, are actually
It's a route.
categories in the unconscious. But the amazing thing about it is, having looked at the Italian Baroque, dynastic Egypt, and Art Deco, you can also say to it, so surprise me. And suddenly, it can surprise you 100%. It can show you objects that you cannot place to any set of motifs, any historical period, past, present, or future. And then you can say to it, surprise me again. And it gives you surprise B, which is completely different from surprise A, and also not related to any known style. So then you say, well, are styles categories in the unconscious, and how many of them are there? And what does it mean then for a group of people in 1680 or 1930 to suddenly find one of these places and punch into it? And then another question is there a necessary historical progression, or is it by chance? In other words, could the political world of the 16th century have lived with the design motifs of Art Deco? Could we have had Columbus arriving in America in a ship consonant with the best canons of Bauhaus design? Strange questions, friends. Is there necessary succession in style, or are these things pure chance? So, I don't know, returning to and responding to your demonic advocacy, it may be that going to Tikal preconditions you, that pushes the button, and then when you take the psychedelic, you discover that the high Mayan, the classic Mayan button had been set, and then you find all this stuff. It's a little more bewildering to have it happen in your living room. So,
those experiences are available to anybody in various states, and there are various ways to get there. And I don't feel that it's mutually exclusive to say that some substances do seem to have a certain predilection for certain kinds of experiences. That I've had both feelings about it. That range of experiences, that band of experience is available, and some things are more likely to put me there than others.
Well, LSD is a relative of morning glories. So if you got Mexican imagery off LSD, that would be understandable. It may be that all the indoles resonate together. And, Rupert's fond of saying the morphogenetic, or the thing which is most impinging on the present, is the immediate and most closely related past. But also impinging is the related past moments and the related contingencies. Perhaps all of the indoles can access each other. One thing that I've done on psilocybin, and you might try this is an interesting experiment. Once you get it up and running smoothly, then you can say to it, be MDMA, and it will be it. And you can say to it, be LSD, and it loves to do imitations of other psychoactive drugs. Well, I don't know. I don't think you can say to MDMA, be DMT, and it will move. You hope not, don't you? And it would move over into that space. But see, obviously, it's some kind of freely commanded modality in the psyche with which we can have a relationship if we will but evolve a control language and a dialogue. And it remains mysterious. It is a point that I made yesterday that I think is worth repeating. The psychedelic experience is the beginning of the spiritual path. That's why it's not important that yogins claim that they can deliver you the psychedelic experience, because it begins with the psychedelic experience. And then you go from there. I said something like this a few weeks ago at the John Ford Theater in LA, and this guy got up and said, "So why don't you take more?" Which I think is a very interesting question, very valid for me personally. And the answer is, our whole lives we conceive of spiritual development as looking for the answer. You know, is it Taoism? Is it diet? Is it Tantra? We look for the answer. And I think we have become so accustomed to looking for the answer that it's never really entered our minds what it would be like to find it. To have it, yes. And once you come face to face with these psychedelics, the trail ends that you have found the answer. Not because you were, perhaps because you're smart, perhaps because you're lucky, perhaps because you deserved it, perhaps because you hang out with the right people. You have found the answer. Now the question is, what the hell do you do with it? Because the answer is going to make hash out of your life, because your life is based on living without the answer. So suddenly, it's not, I want to be an enlightened being, I want to be a shaman, I want to be a Taoist, I want to be a yogi. Be it. See how you like it. So the answer to the question, why don't I take more, is because I'm attached, basically. It is entirely my own attachments that now impede my spiritual growth. Nobody's holding me back. Nothing is holding me back except my sense of the awesomeness of what is now possible. And this is true of everybody who reaches a certain point. Think of the Taoist sage on Cold Mountain who has been up there in the fog and the mist and the rock escarpments for 30, 40, 50 years. And the people in the village occasionally mention him to each other and say, is old Fusi still alive? Has anyone seen him recently? And someone will say, oh yes, I saw him 3 years ago across a valley gathering wood, but when I approached, he ran further up the mountain and disappeared. To be Fusi is entirely possible, to actually attain what we have previously thought of as unattainable spiritual accomplishments. But I don't think it can happen without leaving everything. Do you really want to be a Taoist hermit circulating the light for 200 years in a cave high up above timberline? You can, there's nothing stopping you once you understand that this psychedelic vehicle is available. I'm appalled at that. It's one thing to change your life to be nicer to your coworkers. It's quite another to change your life to be incomprehensible to 99.9% of all humanity. So once you have the psychedelic tool in hand, then real choices have to be made. What is this to you? Is it simply something that you do once or twice a year to affirm to yourself that it's possible? Or is it something that you can use in some way for your good and the world's? That's sort of where I have come to rest, and I hope it's not a delusion. But I think that there are ideas out there, and that they don't do any good out there, that they only have efficacy if brought into 3 dimensions. And there are all kinds of ideas. In fact, they are all ideas. So we're talking about a more efficient internal combustion engine, how people can learn to love each other, how to save the planet, the most efficient way of packing crackers in a box for long shelf life and low destruction of their structural integrity. It doesn't matter what the problem is. The answer can be found out there. Well, it puts people who are into this psychedelic thing in an entirely different stance from all other spiritual seekers, because all other spiritual seekers are furiously seeking. Psychedelic people are holding it back with all their power because they are in the presence of the mystery, and then the trick is to get a spigot on it so that it can be turned on and off rather than just coming at you like a tidal wave a mile high and 20 miles wide. So it's a different problem, an embarrassment of riches, an embarrassment of access to past, present, future, alien dimensions, mantra-hoarding elves, and promise-bearing demons. And so strangely enough, it creates a certain kind of conservatism. Now, I don't think that everybody realizes this. Many people take psychedelics in order to prove to themselves that they can and then gain acceptance from their social group. It's a way of fitting in. But those people, you can always evade the mystery. Not always. But if you're trying to, from the get-go, you can evade fully confronting the mystery. And but if it's what you want, you will quickly discover that you have hit the main vein, and that changes the rules of the game pretty entirely.
They'll do it up to a point, and particularly sophisticated psychologists and like that say, well, it'll take you so far, but then there's something else, and you have to quit doing this and give it up and do something else. And my experience is what that is, it's not true. That you want to keep doing it and take it as far as you want to go.
That's what I think. I think people who quit doing it see something, detect, because what it is if you think of the self as a diamond, and you begin to, and then what the psychedelic is pressure on the diamond. Well, you can raise the pressure to 1,000 pounds per square inch, and there are no structural flaws. But if you raise the pressure to 10,000 pounds per square inch, micro flaws begin to show and shear lines appear. And because everything will fly apart at a certain level, one cannot encompass this mystery. I mean, I think finally you have to avert your eyes and just, adore is a strange word, and worship is also a strange word, but certainly give credit to. It is not a program that you finish. And yes, people who say, I learned all I could from it, probably learned mostly that they shouldn't do more of it.
It's a route.
You're a psychotherapist.
Well, it threatens to put anybody out of a job because eventually the contradictions of living in this low-level slice of reality will just become unbearable. And this actually happened in the 60s. I mean, many people quit and dropped out for many reasons, but the seed of all that talk about is you just say, this is absurd. I am going to sit. That's not absurd. But, what about your stock brokerage? What about your portfolio? What about your divorce in progress? So all of this stuff, you can't... No, I think that the depth of this cannot be taken. And eventually, the male ego in every single one of us, regardless of our gender, will feel threatened. Because it's hardly different from death, because... you're not going to recognize yourself. That's the point that I wanted to make in talking about the guy up on Cold Mountain. Once he ran a gas station. Once he followed the Dodgers. But then it all began to slide in this certain direction, and he is no longer recognizable to himself. Carlos Castaneda has Don Juan say, "You must lose your personal history." Well, I don't know whether Don Juan is a real person or whether he ever said that, but it's interesting, that notion. How many of us would be willing to become unrecognizable to ourselves? And yet, obviously, that's the path that one is on. And so then you just decide, well, is there an obligation to go to the end? Do I have to become a genie? Do I have to become a Taoist sage, an immortal? And I think the answer is no. You know, one doesn't have to do that. Buddhism creates the notion of the bodhisattva. That is, in a way, this same thing. It's where you're just about to go over the hill into incomprehensibility, and then you say, wait a minute, what about the people in the prisons, the naked, the hungry, the oppressed? And you pull back and say, no, I forswear enlightenment until the last being attains enlightenment. Well, it's a noble gesture, but I'll bet these bodhisattvas make this vow with a tremendous sigh of relief. Now they know what they're going to do with their lives. Oh, good, I'm going to work in prisons and counsel the dying and get into political action. Geez, for a minute I thought I was going to go straight into the light. And become unrecognizable to myself and lose my definitions and so forth and so on.
I will. The comment, the two words that struck me interesting was adore and worship. I don't know if I got it right. Matthew Fox Friday night quoted some theologian, I think it was Desjardins, and it struck me interesting because he said that we have come to a point in history now where we must either find some form of meaningful worship or commit suicide. And somehow that quote came back when you mentioned when one may reach that point of the penultimate truth of the unspeakable or the formless form or the light or whatever you want to call it, and the mushrooms are pointing the way or whatever, breath therapy, that all these things are only something that points you to the ultimate. And when you get there, it moves into the adoration and the worship level, which, interestingly enough, as I say, coming from a mode of being a recovering Catholic, I could never find in any kind of religious community, and didn't want to join a monastery for that purpose. And what I see is partially this neurosis or unhappiness that exists in so many people in the country. They have no contextual format for worship because it doesn't have that power for them to do it.
Yes, well, you have to have the personal experience of something to worship. And this is what has been lacking. I mean, what the churches are peddling is high abstraction, and you really have to work yourself up into a lather to, be able to accept that as worthy of that kind of attention. The psychedelic subset of society is into an experience. And, it's accessible. In a way, we're like Calvinists, not in our ethics or our restraint on behavior, but in our insistence on a direct personal relationship with the mystery. And this is something very new. We have really accepted the idea that truth descends through hierarchies, basically from Newsweek and Time and the Washington Post down to us as consumers of these various images of what is going on. The notion that you might know more about reality than the combined editorial board of Scientific American and the Journal of Foreign Affairs is startling stuff. We always give ourselves away. We don't realize it depends on you, to believe that at Cornell or down at SRI, people understand the universe, is not helpful. You must understand the universe. And if you don't know partial differential calculus, then your model of how the universe works must do it without partial differential calculus. In other words, it's not writ anywhere that only one model will work, and in fact, I think all abstract models should be highly suspect. It's going to be, it's an opportunity. I mean, we have to view life as an opportunity. What are you doing with it? Are you afraid of it? I mean, some people live their lives, apparently, what they are doing is arranging their deathbed scene. They want it to take place in a large baronial house with clipped green lawns, acres in surround. They want the room in which they die to be filled with fine art. They want their loving heirs to be dutifully assembled while they pass out the final wisdom, and they spend their entire life creating the dramatic scenario of their passage. And of course you have to work hard, because you've got to make the money to buy that house. You have to sire all these children, educate them into your values so they won't be stabbing you in the back and misbehaving in this situation. You have to create loyalty, possession, power, all of these things. And then you won't die in a ditch, unknown and abandoned, you know. But on the other hand, what was the quality of that life, you know? Life is an opportunity. How much pressure should you put on it? How many places should you go? How many drugs should you take? How many sexual configurations should you experiment with? How many professions should you, and it depends, I think, the question is, how seriously do you take it? Do you just think life is a lark and it's fine with you that you're going to go into a pine box and be forgotten for all eternity? Or do you have some inner consolation that that won't happen and you're going to go off and be with Lao Tzu and Mao and everybody else who ever died? Or, you know, just what is it? And I think of it as a telephone booth being filled with water. And you can see that when the water reaches the top of the telephone booth, you're going to be dead as a doornail. And so you have 30 years to figure it out. We are alive. There's no contest about that. It's extremely improbable that we should be alive, that we should be here thinking, feeling, sharing. The fact that we're alive throws open the whole game. Means anything is probably possible, but I doubt that it's easy. I'll bet you have to be very, very smart to figure out what's going on and get it right. And so I guess I have a sort of private religion of intelligence. It isn't how good you are, it's how wily you are, which was the Greek virtue of Odysseus, you know. That was always his epitaph. Or his epithet was, he was wily Ulysses. Reality is some kind of maze. It isn't to the swift that the race goes. A maze, a puzzle garden that you walk through to try and find your way out. The race isn't to the swift, it's to the thoughtful, the careful, the one who can tease it all apart. Well, for puzzle solving, the psychedelic is this tremendously powerful tool because it extends the domain of mind, and that's what's necessary to make it go. Okay, moving through these things and discussing dosage, probably in order of the likelihood of your encountering them. Mushrooms, I feel that people who weigh around 140 pounds should take 5 dried grams. This is a stiff hit. This is a committed hit. There will be difficult moments in a 5-gram trip, but on the other hand, certain questions will be solved forever for you. Because you will validate the existence of this dimension, you will see what your relationship to it is. I don't believe in diddling with these things. people tend to take tiny amounts, thinking that 1/10 of a dose is 1/10 of an experience. Well, that doesn't work like that. I mean, half a dose can be no experience at all, and a full dose can feel like 10 of these experiences. So trivializing it is really, and I use this word advisedly, but sinful, because you're trivializing the only mystery, or one of the, it's like trivializing sex. I mean, the ordinary objections to pornography are not my objections, but to my mind, a very strong objection to pornography is that it trivializes. And anything which trivializes anything central to our self-definition is bad mental hygiene, is about the only way I could put it. And taking small doses of psychedelics tends to trivialize them. And there are people who probably take LSD every weekend and go dancing and have done this for years and have no idea what LSD is capable of. The main shift in the use pattern with LSD is from, I mean, it may have been childish, but the style of the 60s was, how many mics can you bolt down? You know, have you had the 500? Have you had the 1,000? Have you had the 2,000? Well, eventually it becomes moot because you just dissolve into shimmering atoms for longer and longer periods of time on these trips. But the modern approach, which is how little can you get away with taking and still be one of the gang, is even more insidious, you know, because then people feel capable of talking about these things. And you know, there are people who feel that their opinions on the psychedelic experience should be weighed very carefully, who have only taken MDMA. Well, listen, I've got news for you. I mean, that is, to the domain we're talking about, like a broken tricycle to a Testarossa Ferrari. So this is a general comment that you should take a committed dose of whatever it is you're taking, so that there is no ambiguity, because there's nothing worse than a sub-threshold psychedelic experience, because what it is it's all show and no go. You know, you feel the CNS activation, you feel the keyboards light up, everything comes on, you start down the runway, you pick up speed, you pick up speed, you pick up speed, and then you come to the end of the runway and taxi back to the hangar, and, you know, well, that was not a flight to Boston, that was just clogging the traffic pattern. So committed doses, and then because you're going to take a committed dose, inform yourself of the medical and pharmacological chit-chat on the matter so that you can feel reassured, you know, and talk to a heart specialist. Questions like, if my heart is pounding, does that mean I'm having a heart attack? What is a fibrillation, and how will I recognize it? Because you can have very odd feelings and not be in any danger whatsoever, you know, and your heart can pound.
Amit
It's made
jól
to
esik, barátom.
pound. Look at all these aerobic exercise freaks. Well, the fact that you're sitting still and this begins to happen doesn't mean that you've been shoved to death's door. It just means, you know, that everything is equalizing and coming to some kind of equilibrium, and you're passing through a transition. These drugs do have a kind of mock barrier. In other words, there is a barrier, somewhat like the speed of sound. It's a pharmacological and physiological barrier. So you take the compound, the plant, whatever it is. Nothing happens for 40 minutes or so except false starts and little things, and you have to go pee, and then you come back and you sit down. And then it begins to come on, and it's like, it can have many manifestations, but it can be chills, tremoring, knotted stomach, nausea, just restlessness, so forth and so on. This is what I call, taking a page from the engineering book, Q. Q in engineering circles is vibration in a physical system. And you may even, when they launch the space shuttle, if you listen to the radio chit-chat, they will say, approaching max Q, and then they'll say, max Q, mark, and then they're through that. What that means is that as the system approaches a transition, it begins to shake. It begins to shake as though it's going to shake to pieces. And the Q forces are building on all the air surfaces, the airframe. Then you break through that, Q falls to 0, and you're in the cool, main engine cutoff. You are now in orbit. All vibration has ceased. Noise has ceased. You are in orbit. You are weightless. You are there. It's different. Now you shut down all these switches related to the launch procedure and begin to set a course through a different kind of medium, a medium characterized by smoothness, stillness, and that sort of thing. LSD, I don't see anything wrong with 300, 400 micrograms as an initial dose. I don't see any point in running up into the 1500 to 2000 gamma range, because in my experience, what happens is at higher doses, there's simply an area where you can't remember what happened. And the higher the dose, the longer that period of time. But since you can't remember anything about it, why, it should be shortened. DMT, 70 milligrams, vaporized in a glass pipe, and 70 milligrams. Yeah.
LSD, I have done large doses of LSD at times, and it's always seemed to me that it's very difficult to process all the stimuli coming out. The biocomputer just, at one point, for me at least, one time I did 4,000 micrograms, and the biocomputer shut down for a while. I like you said, I forgot exactly.
Yeah, it's overload, and it just shunts it past you. What do we need to cover here? DMT, psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, which, I think probably you all know, 125, 150 milligrams. And because I tell you these doses doesn't necessarily mean I approve of all these things. I'm just saying if you take them, these are the doses. Ketamine, people take small amounts. Again, usually after attaining some amount of proficiency with it. I've only done it 4 or 5 times, and always fairly large doses, 130, 150. Interesting compound, but contraindicated because of physiological problems. Depresses the immune system, possibility of epileptic kindling. Certainly, if you were to vomit in that state, you might well strangle because you wouldn't be able to clear your throat. I don't like, what I have against ketamine also is you have to shoot it, As I was driving home last night, I was listening to some program, and they were talking about intravenous drugs. And I thought, how interesting. That's a distinction you don't hear made very often. They were saying we should legalize all drugs except intravenous drugs. Well, so that's, of course, morphine, cocaine, heroin, ketamine, steroids, I suppose, like that. That's an interesting distinction, operationally. Yeah. You can, but I would, I've heard that it's dangerous because, yeah, it's IM. It's IM. When they give it as an anesthetic, they give it 600 milligrams IV push, which must be just like being struck from behind by a freight train. I'm sure you never know what hit you. I mean, imagine an exploratory dose is 100, let's say, IM. They're talking about IV directly into the vein, 600 push. that means pressure on the feeder, so it's just like a high pressure filling of your gas tank. You would never know what hit you. Yeah, although now they've pulled it from general surgery, even veterinary surgery, because it seems to depress the immune system. And the worst thing you could do is do surgery on somebody and then put them into a surgical recovery ward with a depressed immune system. So that is kind of out. I must say about ketamine, it did something to me that nothing else has ever done, which is it erodes the observer in a way that the indoles don't. On ketamine, you can get so out there that it is a major intellectual breakthrough to realize that you're on a drug. In other words, there's this situation, and it seems like it's always been there, and it always will be there, and you can't remember who you are, or what you are, or where you are, and this situation continues, and there's something about it, but you can't quite put your finger on it, and there's never been anything else, there'll never be anything else, and then suddenly comes this tiny thought, you're on a drug. Oh, right. I remember now. That's it. I'm a human being. I took a drug. I'm a human being, and I took a drug, and that's what this is. This is a trip. Right. That's it. This is a trip. I'm on a trip. Now I've got it. Now I'm in. Well, what this means is you're now coming down. The trip is now over with because you have, yeah. Being so lost that it was a victory to realize
No, not a victory, but I was just in that state where there was only eternity. There was no trace back to any family member, to anything. I just knew that this person which was sitting was a familiar person. From somewhere I knew this person. And I felt calm with that.
And it was yourself.
No, there was none of us. My sitter was there.
Oh, I see.
Who was sitting in the next room. But I was for hours just totally no connection to anything which was connected to my personality or to life.
Was that a 5 grand dose?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Well, I think probably, I would imagine that this is...
It was amazing. It was wonderful to be there, to see that everything is just made up of our mind, and to see how this world is made up. And, why do we have architectures and police and all this? It's just incredible to think about that.
Yes, maybe this is the white light. Maybe this is what these early LSD people were so enamored of, was getting so far into it that you don't even know you're into it because you can't remember where you started from. It sort of is not what I'm shooting for because I always want to bring stuff back. See, my conviction is... Oh no, I had my conviction reversed, but my belief is that... my belief is that this stuff is important for all of us, that we're in some kind of lower dimensional slice, and what you see in the psychedelic experience actually has historical implications. And I find this sort of paradoxical because I'm the person who draws everybody's attention to the fact that people have been doing this for 50,000 years. So in a way, that sounds like I'm saying it's not a big deal. It's part of the human heritage. Certain people have always known about this. Yeah.
Start though, like that point between where there's nothing and then all of a sudden, coming back in, the observer kicks in. That's the big issue in my life. Is like, where did the observer come from? Is it an evolutionary thing? Like animals never have it when they fade into the white light? I mean, do you have anything to say about that little place in between, way in there?
Well, I think it begins with self-reflection. In other words, the question, what's happening? I don't think animals ever ask that question. For animals, what's happening is what's happening. But we are capable of creating a state of distance and posing the question, what is happening? And at that point in the trip, It means you're making your way back to the modality that you left from. You're drawing away from the translinguistic place. And it truly is translinguistic. Nothing can be taken out of it. But at the interface of the sayable and the unsayable is the novel, the new, the never before seen, said, or done. And that's what I think it's important to try and bring out. Ideas. Because I think we are the animals that bring back ideas. Somehow our hunting and gathering adaptation then set us loose in our own minds. And, you know, somebody came back and said, let's throw a chunk of this meat in the fire and see what happens. It's this see what happens attitude. So then suddenly they discovered, well, meat burned in fires is easier to digest and tastes better. And by this means, this let's see what happens approach to things, the ideas come in the mental dimension. The let's see what happens translates those of them that can be translated into three-dimensional space. Let's plant this plant. Let's slaughter this animal. Let's trisex this way. Let's go over that hill this year instead of that hill. And what has come out of this is the entire legacy of our cultural heritage as a global civilization. But all of these ideas began in the mind. And what are ideas? Well, this is the central question of Platonic philosophy. And what are we that we seem to separate the doable from the undoable in the realm of ideas, and then anything that can be done, we do. It doesn't matter how perverse, how painful, how destructive, how grandiose, how wonderful, how sublime. If it can be done, we do it. And then, in this three-dimensional domain of space and time, these ideas compete with each other like organisms. And an ecology of mind evolves. That's really what culture is. It's the ecology that mind has created for itself, in the same way that bees create a beehive, and then the beehive is the cultural context of bee-ness. We have created civilization through language, and then civilization has become the context for humanness, and yet we always seek to transcend it and go beyond it. Now, I don't know whether this is something innate in us or whether it is somehow programmed in from the planet at different levels. Because it's very interesting, you know, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but there are leafcutter ants in the tropics. I mean, they're a major part of life in the tropics. And they march in columns through the jungle, and they can swarm up a tree and take all the leaf material off a large jungle tree in a matter of hours. And what they do with these leaves is they return sometimes great distances with these, each one carrying like a little banner, a chunk of leaf. And they go down into their nests, and they chew it up, and they stick it on the walls. Surface, or some of them go back to the surface, and they gather spores on their antenna, and then they go back down into the anthill, and they inject or inoculate the chewed plant material with these spores. Well, naturally, this chewed plant material is pretty organic and funky, so it begins to grow all kinds of things. Molds, mildews, bacteria, so forth and so on. And what the ants do is they farm this and weed out all these bad bacteria and small microfungi and organisms, and only cultivate this one fungus, which then converts the plant material into a usable sugar. So what this is it's a symbiotic relationship between the fungi and the ant.